So welcome, everyone. This panel is titled Public Options, Public Utilities, and Public Spheres. Joining me today, and I'll start from the far left, and I'll just do names and titles. I can assure you this is an illustrious panel, but if you'd like to confirm, you can take a look at their extended bios in the program. So we have Ganesh Sitaraman from Vanderbilt Law School, John Samples from the Cato Institute, Zephyr Teachout, a professor at Fordham Law School, and Richard John, a professor at the Columbia Journalism School. So this panel picks up from where the last two panels left off. It looks at proposals to ensure that the digital public sphere is actually serving the public. And the papers come at this question from very different angles. But to concretize the conversation right away, I might just summarize each of the papers in a couple of sentences. Zephyr, your paper with Sabile argues for regulating the platforms as public utilities. While supportive of antitrust measures, you argue that they're not sufficient if we want to promote a healthy and democratic public sphere. You argue we need to focus on their underlying business model by banning targeted ads. Ganesh, your paper makes the national security case for breaking up big tech. You argue that breaking up and regulating the platforms isn't just desirable, it's necessary if we want to preserve America's competitiveness, national defense, and democratic freedoms in a new age of great power competition, and in particular between the US and China. John Samples, your paper takes a much more skeptical view of proposals to regulate the platforms. You argue that previous attempts to regulate the media in the public interest led to major problems like regulatory capture, censorship, and the suppression of political dissent. So Richard, I might actually start with you as the historian on the panel. The idea of regulating the nation's communications networks in the public interest isn't new. You've written extensively about how anti-monopoly tools have played a central role in US communications policy for many decades, up until fairly recently. Could you start the panel by providing us with some reflections on that history and how those tools helped shape the public sphere?
Sure. Thanks, Ramya. We're on, right? Yeah. Well, I understand there was some imagining this morning, Ethan Zuckerman. So let's imagine. Let's imagine a tech platform with a legal mandate to protect the privacy of its users, a funding scheme that relied on targeted user fees to massively subsidize on a non-preferential basis the circulation of information on public affairs, and a development strategy that facilitated the building out of a network to facilitate throughout the country the circulation of messages of all kinds, including information on public affairs, almost entirely without regard to cost. As it happens, we don't have to imagine such a tech platform, since it once existed, and in fact was one of the most enduring contributions of the founders of the United States to free expression, commerce, and democratic governance. The Knight Institute quite properly celebrates the First Amendment, which became law in 1791. Yet for the first 130 years of U.S. history, the First Amendment was little more than the mere parchment barrier that its principal architect, James Madison, feared it would be. The first major First Amendment Supreme Court case, after all, not decided until 1919. Far more consequential was the communications revolution set in motion in the year after the constitutionalization of the Bill of Rights, with the enactment, also with Madison's earnest support, of the Post Office Act of 1792, the law that created the tech platform that I just described. If we are concerned about the present-day regulation of tech platforms, as I believe all 21st century lawmakers should be, and if we respect the wisdom of Madison, Washington, and the other founders of the Republic, as I believe all American citizens should be, then we would be well to remember the unprecedented extent to which in the United States free expression received an indispensable boost from a regulatory regime that institutionalized a far more expansive commitment to free expression than would have been conceivable in Great Britain, France, or any other 18th century state. The topic of this panel is public options, public utilities, public spheres, with a particular emphasis on free expression. I've been asked as a historian to provide some reflection. So here goes. Public options. I've already alluded to the founders' clear preference for a public option, a preference that would be reflected in the decades-long struggle, ultimately unsuccessful, for a postal telegraph, and in the far more successful establishment of institutional mechanisms for the regulation of the telephone, radio, and television. We can quarrel about what we mean by public. Yet it's undeniable that all three of these tech platforms, telephone, radio, television, each of which have been primarily coordinated by corporate managers rather than government administrators, each of these platforms operated for much of the 20th century in accordance with norms that have been powerfully conditioned by a capacious vision of the public interest. To put it a bit differently, if we think seriously about the relationship of public policy to tech platforms, then, as the old Hindu proverb says, it's turtles all the way down. The gods of the computer and consumer electronic industries, in the judgment of the world's greatest business historian, Alfred D. Chandler, the gods, and he's drawing self-consciously here on the language of epic poetry, who were the gods? They were the middle-level bureaucrats in the antitrust division of the U.S. Justice Department, while the fates were the corporations that intervened to shape the course of events. Okay, 3 quick examples about public option. Since at least the 1830s, U.S. regulators have been wary of foreign involvement in U.S. tech platforms. In 1840, for example, the U.S. Patent Commissioner blocked British inventors from obtaining a broad patent to an electric telegraph, favoring instead his college classmate, Samuel Morse. In the 1880s, the U.S. Supreme Court repeatedly frustrated challenges by foreign claimants to Alexander Graham Bell's telephone patents, and in 1919, the U.S. Navy pressured the British wireless telegraph promoter Guglielmo Marconi to sell his U.S. wireless tech platform to American firms. Public utility. This raises some similar questions for a historian. The U.S. telegraph network in the 1880s, as Zephyr and Sabile astutely observe, operated in an anti-monopoly regulatory regime that discouraged network providers from providing a mass service for the entire population. Anti-monopoly and mass service were antagonistic. It was thus not surprising that the dominant telegraph network provider, Western Union, became the personal fiefdom of the most notorious financial speculator of the age, Jay Gould, and was universally reviled for throttling free expression by colluding with the New York Associated Press to block new entrants from entering the news business. Get this, the New York Associated Press got low rates. Western Union, in turn, was guaranteed that no New York Associated Press member would criticize its operations in a newspaper. Nice work if you can get it. The telephone business, in contrast, was shaped from the outset, like the radio business, by the protean, municipally based public utility standard of public interest, convenience, and necessity. Municipal franchise regulators exerted a particularly large influence in the operation of the big city operating companies maintained by American Telephone and Telegraph, popularly known as Bell. So too did antitrust. It mattered too. The interoperability of the telephone and the telegraph was a pet idea of the Bell tech platform empire builder Theodore Vail. Yet Vail suffered a crushing defeat in 1913 when, to settle an antitrust suit, the U.S. Attorney General, James McReynolds, ordered Bell to divest its holdings in the telegraph giant Western Union, while obliging it to establish protocols to connect with non-Bell network providers. Antitrust pressure would shape the telephone tech platform for the rest of the century. Government pressure forced Bell out of the sound recording business, the radio broadcasting business, and the computer business. That didn't just happen. That was due to government pressure, separations principle that Tim Wu's written about. In the telecom sector, as in so many other realms, creative statecraft and innovation were mutually self-sustaining and symbiotically linked. The technical achievements of Bell's R&D division, Bell Labs, are of course well known. Yet competition could also foster innovation, as Ganesh Sitaraman perceptively observes, and so too did the legally mandated segmentation of network providers. Just because it's possible to consolidate does not mean that consolidation promotes the public good. Lawmakers understood that in the American past. Third topic, public spheres. All right, 3 bullet points, time short. First, the pre-Civil War public sphere was decisively shaped by the draconian restrictions on the circulation across state boundaries of information on the slavery issue. These draconian restrictions were enacted in the 1830s by every slaveholding state and enforced by the federal government. The heirs of Thomas Jefferson, the libertarians of the day, entirely supported those. There's no libertarian free expression tradition in the United States if you acknowledge the importance of these boundaries. Not until New York Times v. Sullivan, the landmark free expression case that the Supreme Court decided in 1964, would this white supremacist cordon sanitaire be broached in a fundamental way. Why we've forgotten about the importance of that cordon sanitaire is a very interesting question. Second, the public sphere created by film and radio was for much of the 20th century regulated by a combination of enlightened self-interest, public pressure, often at the state and municipal level, and political fiat. It's a tragic fact that the first U.S. cinematic blockbuster was a racist celebration of domestic terrorists. Unfortunately, the NAACP boycott of Birth of a Nation got nowhere. More successful was the 1939 ban that the National Association of Broadcasters enacted to block its member stations from carrying the virulently anti-Semitic broadcasts of Father Coughlin, a demagogic radio preacher who, among other things, had defended on the air the Nazi anti-Jewish pogrom known as Kristallnacht. Okay, that's the second. And the National Association of Broadcasters was under antitrust pressure at the time, which is one reason they took that initiative. Third bullet point. The public sphere created by the Bell system, the dominant telephone tech platform in the mid-20th century, and it's created the bowels of today's internet. This public sphere was for many decades systematically mischaracterized in Bell public relations announcements as the necessary byproduct of technical imperatives and market incentives. It's all about technology and economics, so Bell told us or sold us, rather than a deliberately contrived amalgam of governmental institutions and civic ideals. Bell, it is worth recalling, invented corporate public relations in the 1910s to help stave off the plausible threat of a federal government takeover. Spent a lot of money on public relations, and they got something for it, interpretation of their own history for the 20th century. Among the many tangible results of their publicity campaign was the bamboozlement of generations of journalists, legal scholars, and historians who repeated as fact Bell-generated boilerplate about Theodore Vail, universal service, and the alleged indispensability of long-distance telephony to Bell's business strategy. Corporations shaped public discourse, and I dare say perhaps corporations are still shaping public discourse today. My observations focus on the past and not the present. It is my hope that by underscoring the indispensable role of public policy in the shaping of the tech platforms of the past, it may be possible to avoid the myopia that has led more than a few commentators to misleadingly lionize garage-based entrepreneurs and neoliberal legal norms in explaining the emergence of the tech platforms of today, and in so doing to impoverish our ability to set the historical record straight so that we may better enable lawmakers, activists, and corporate leaders better help them devise governmental institutions that will more properly align our nation's justly praised civic ideals, including tradition of free expression, better align those ideals with the tech platforms of the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. I have a question about the history of telecommunications you tell, the subject of your last book, Network Nation. Mm-hmm. It's striking that it's not mainly a history of breakups, though they did happen, and you mentioned that there was significant antitrust pressure in the mix, but it's a history of regulated monopolies. And on one view, the very idea of a communications monopoly poses risks to free speech. And those risks are only magnified when you're talking about a platform like Facebook, which, unlike the telegraph or the telephone, is not a neutral or passive conduit.
Right.
And so I wonder what your thoughts are on whether we should be regulating the platforms in the model of Western Union or AT&T, or at least the more conduit-like aspects of those platforms.
So is there a usable past? Yeah. Bell had a lot in common with Google in the 19-teens. It would have expanded into other realms if it hadn't been blocked from doing so. So one way to think about the present and the past is that there were an awful lot of institutional mechanisms to constrain Bell, including the threat of government ownership, I suppose, public option, if you will, that don't, to a historian, seem to be as evident today. It's very hard to make a case that Western Union is a model for anything. It did serve the business community well, and Alfred Chandler's grandfather wrote so in public, but he's about the only public figure in the 1880s who has a good word to say for Western Union. It did not provide facilities for the entire population, did not aspire to. It was not innovative after a brief moment in the 1870s when it was competition with the firm that Gould eventually used to take it over. And it was not administratively or sophisticated. Or we could, for example, you could have envisioned the United States being a presence in the international cable market. Ganesh is interested in international issues, but we ceded that market to the Brits and the Germans. So there, I think that kind of anti-monopoly, predicated on the idea that we should break up big firms or create opportunities for new entrants, did not serve America's business users particularly well. And in fact, it unleashed something, and we haven't talked much about this today, because one of the peculiarities of Google and Facebook is that the founders are still running them, or they're still around, or we still know their names. This isn't going to be the case forever. And the possibility of a kind of financial explosion when Zephyr Teachout writes about this. What will happen if Facebook really begins to monetize the resources that it has at its disposal because there's some kind of financial pressure? That's what was going on with Western Union, and that's something that Bell blocked. In other words, Bell got itself out of the financial markets. Morgan was much less important for Bell, say, than Gould was for Western Union. The possibility of these huge corporations becoming financial instruments in their own right, I think, from the perspective of the historian, is quite frightening.
John, let's turn to you. Your paper focuses on a slightly different set of historical interventions, the progressive broadcast reforms from the early to mid-20th century that incorporated the public interest standard. You argue that this standard disserved the public interest in important ways. Why are you concerned about proposals to revive the public interest standard?
So the joke was, I think it's wrong. I think some of the founders think they are going to live forever, and judging by their diets and their plans and various things, their investments in certain kinds of genetic whatever. But maybe they won't. They'll probably come up short there. Yeah, so I was thinking about this paper, sort of the talk about this conference was about breaking up. So I sort of conceived it, or Paul Matsko and I conceived this as there's a choice between, roughly speaking, breaking up on the one hand and then sort of a managed monopoly or managed dominant firms on the other. And so we decided to talk a little bit about the history of the management issue through the Federal Radio Commission, Federal Communications Commission. And yes, part of it is about the fairness doctrine. Part of it is about general, on the radio side, about the stories we tell, the cases, about general First Amendment issues early under the radio. And then finally, there's also a case that's relatively shorter that's about entry and the use of entry from newspapers, cross-ownership, basically, is another of our examples. Now, why is this relevant? First of all, when we went through the comments, there was a question about whether the public interest model itself was relevant. And I made some case, Philip Napoli has a new book out that's all about this public interest. I think it may be making a comeback, and that's in the literature. But also, as I thought about this for this preparation, it seems to me that the public interest model has powerful political reasons behind it. That is to be said for it, not maybe in a normative way, but in a just experiential way, empirical way, which is that both elected officials and companies, the leaders of companies, may prefer a managed monopoly to break up. Now, it's arguably, and I think most people who argue for breakup believe that users, consumers in general, citizens, however you pose it, would prefer the breakup to respond to concentration. But on the other hand, the people who have concentrated benefits, concentrated interest may prevail. Why would elected officials and companies prefer managed monopoly over a breakup? Is because if you're an elected official in particular, well, it's obvious, I think, why the companies would prefer it, right? But if you're an elected official, if you get more companies and you get more speech, that's not necessarily what you want. Right? One of the underlying parts of all of our discussions here is the assumption that the government can act in ways that people at this conference think it should act. It can be true that you can set government afoot in ways you think they should, and it turns out to be something else. That's really something you don't want. That's the burden of my paper. Elected officials may not want to break up because it's more speech. They may prefer a managed situation, and that's you can read the FCC argument. The other thing I would say about this paper that we didn't highlight enough, it's part of it, don't get caught on the content level, or at least it's about content regulation in the FCC example, but don't stop there. The crucial thing that we don't emphasize and take for granted is what was the leverage that government officials had. So there was two elements to it: content regulation, including the fairness doctrine, but also leverage. Now, in that period, what the leverage was, the FCC, was obviously, it was a licensing regime, right? And so you could, when Nixon went after them, they went after the local stations to get CBS News to have better content from Nixon's perspective, but they did it by threatening the licenses of the local. And crucially also, I should mention, I'm sort of telling you a pessimistic story in some respects. I'm telling you a story about warnings, but in fact, the fairness doctrine fell apart because politically it wasn't stable. Both sides saw by 1972, and journalists too, to their credit, saw that it was a threat to freedom of speech. So then we go on and talk about the Hawley Bill. Now, we sort of did that initially because we were encouraged to talk about something. But I think the Hawley Bill is important because it has something in it that's going to be the part of any kind of legislation in this area, and that's the voting rule, right? So if you look at the problem of setting up a government agency, and you're an elected official here, whether you come, let's just say, from the left or the right, the red, the blue, you've got the problem is that you don't trust the other guy, right? And the stakes seem to be very high. So if you look at how Hawley solved that, and I think it would be true for anything that's going to happen here, he solved it by having a voting rule which you have 5 members who grant a license, a certificate of neutrality in his terms. You have 5 people voting, and there has to be at least 1 member of the minority that votes for a neutrality certification. And what that means is that at least 1 member of both parties have to sign off on essentially a license for a social media. But whatever is done, you're going to unless, one party or the other is incredibly dumb, you're going to have voting rules that give them a veto over any kind of legislation, which was not true. It was not true in the FCC, which means that you may end up with something you don't expect. And whatever you do, I think is going to, I will argue at least here broadly on that, you're going to end up with something that, in the paper we used the example that you could have, it's one thing to say both parties are protected against one another, but it's not the same thing as saying free speech is going to be protected. And the example I would use for the future would be 2016 and Bernie Sanders. There are intra-party divides. There are also people outside the party structure, and they are going to be not included in that. You could have the certificate of neutrality, by the way, or whatever the licensing or whatever is given in exchange for the right to operate, is going to be ultimately about content. Now, so I would say the question I have is, I was asked the question, well, what about non-content regulation, like interoperability and other things? I think the question is, are there any non-content regulations, right? Sure, there are interoperability obviously doesn't involve speech, but it depends on what policymakers want. If they care enough about controlling the speech, then you can go into other areas, other kinds of regulations. And if, for example, from another paper, or it has been mooted here several times, something like a change of a business model, if you're Facebook and you're very much against that because it would knock 3/4 or more of your value off, you're going to give up a lot to avoid that. And if you do that, even though it's actually a non-content regulation, It depends in the end, what do people in government want? And I suspect they're going to want content regulation because members of Congress seem very concerned about what's said, right? And members of political parties seem concerned about what's said. And so the question is, how intent are they on controlling hostile speech, and what is the response from the companies? How much are they willing to give up? The other thing I will say at the end, I meant to say at the first, the crucial question here is, CBS News had protections against the Nixon administration, and you still got, I would read Tom Hazlitt's book, The Political Spectrum. There was new stuff in there about CBS News and its responsiveness to the Nixon administration, which was much worse than I thought. It seems to me that, the other problem with social media is that no one has a First Amendment right against them. And they certainly have weakened First Amendment rights, at least at this point, against the government itself. So it would be very easy, I think, if I were an elected official, to persuade Mark Zuckerberg or whomever, they all do content moderation, to do it in a way that would be favorable to people who have power over a certificate of neutrality or other kinds of regulation.
So you say you're concerned about content-based proposals and also content-neutral proposals to the extent that they're susceptible to political pressure and political leverage. But what about proposals that involve, for example, strict limits or prohibitions on current business practices? And I'm thinking here, for example, of Zephyr and Sabil's proposal to ban targeted ads. Would you have the same sorts of concerns there?
Yeah, well, I was trying to talk about that. I didn't mention it specifically. So we've talked about this, about the government essentially makes the choice of the business model. And that's, I think, I probably differ in outlook and mood from many people here. That seems to me an extraordinary thing. But by the way, I was at a conference in Stanford on a panel in late May, and the same thing came up. It was a panel of conservatives, and they wanted to change the business model too. Glenn Reynolds.
Yeah, then write the names down.
So, poor Mark Zuckerberg, all he has is the libertarians. He's a dead man. I'm joking. So, if you have that kind of power, and as I said, that was the three-quarters comment. I mean, I don't know what would happen to the net value of Facebook if you got rid of the business model and you had to go to a fee model, which is not chosen by the market, right? And what would you do to avoid that? What kind of deal do you come out of these kinds of situations is the question I ask. And generally, I just want to raise the question that politics doesn't exactly work in a rationalist way, to put it mildly. You can we've had a lot of discussion here about we should do this and we should do that. What I'm trying to raise is the question about what's going to actually happen when you do this, what's likely to happen.
I guess I just wonder where that leaves us, though, because any regulation of the social media platforms is going to be the result of the give and take of the political process, right? So is there any kind of regulation that you would be comfortable with?
So now the question I want to raise is the following. I have this friend, Arnold Kling, who says, I don't know if you know him, he's a blogger, the markets fail, government fails, choose markets, maybe, right? Which one do you choose? What we tend to forget in this area, and it's also particularly important that this is an area that's sensitive because it involves speech. This is just not this is not to choose the example, fake milk in Caroline products. This is speech that is involved in the regulation. But I would say there is an alternative, which we have discussed briefly in passing, or at least an emerging alternative. There is private content moderation, and Facebook is trying to create a broad content moderation function, which has not yet failed, although people distrust it, I guess. But I think it's going to start next year. That's an alternative. My point is there's lots, this is an area, we're going to have some sort of regulation because the companies have said that content moderation it's not just Facebook. There's lots of content moderation going on. So who is best to do it from a free speech standpoint? And then that's because that's a heavy value, right? So then you can bring in other things, other considerations, but I don't think it's apparent. And I guess what I'm trying to say is when you say we do these things or we change an entire industry, I think you mean you, but also it may not be you when the actual work is done. And you may end up with something that you didn't want. The people who created the FCC in this, I guess they were still alive in early 1971, and they didn't foresee Charles Colson, perhaps. I don't know. That's what I'm saying. But it would go either way. I mean, I'm not sure who would win here. I'm just sure that somebody would do it.
Zephyr, and I'll give you an opportunity to describe your paper in a little bit, but your paper suggests that one reason that you make the proposal you do is to avoid some of the more fraught questions of content moderation and free speech. Does that mean that you agree with John, at least to the extent that the revival of a public interest standard of the kind that we had in the early 20th century, but for the digital sphere, would be problematic?
Yes or no?
It's a great question, and as he was speaking, I was thinking that myself, and I'm not ready to fully answer it. I do think that there are there's some genuinely fraught issues with any governmental involvement in content, though. I mean, I think that to me I take as very serious, and something that we should all be concerned about. And we have this extraordinary array, as Richard talked about, of other ways to deal with some of the very real pathologies that we're facing. So I start there with thinking we should start there.
Okay.
So let me just say that what you just said is the reason I came here. See, I'm trying to find common ground so that we can both, whatever else we disagree about, we care about freedom of speech at some level. We may disagree about a bunch of stuff in Q&A, but the concern is something you should have. That's my argument.
Okay. Well, let's get to the affirmative case for breakups and public utility regulation. So Zephyr, you're in favor of breakups, but you argue that they won't be sufficient to address the speech-related pathologies created by the platforms. In your paper, you propose applying a public utility framework and imposing a ban on targeted ads. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, sure. Just to flag for future discussion, I think the area where John and I may deeply disagree is that I see the threat of Facebook and Google and Amazon as a form of governmental power, that we have granted governmental power. So it's a false choice to see a choice between one government and one private sphere. It's rather different forms of governmental regulation. I want to thank my co-author, who can't be here, who really contributed the public utility part of the argument, so I'm going to focus less on that. And also thank Lena Khan, because a conversation with her last May really spurred this paper. Much of what we have talked about today is the ways in which our current moment is a moment we have faced variations of before. And notwithstanding Richard's powerful counterexample, I would say that we have never had the essential communications infrastructure of our country be funded overwhelmingly by surveillance-based business model that is targeted ad-based. So I do think that we are facing a new challenge there. However, we do have a long tradition of public utility regulation that used various tools, including most prominently common carriage, non-discrimination principles, and pricing regimes to regulate certain forms of infrastructure that we, on a local or national level, decided were so essential that we needed to make sure that their business model did not operate in a way to undermine the public good or the public sphere. So although the particular form of business model intervention I'm going to talk about is a new form of business model intervention, all of these forms of, prior forms of public utility regulation really did directly affect business model, most notably pricing. The pricing regimes governing water, electricity, railroads, and others all affected the business model. Second, before I get to some examples or to play out what this means, I want to directly address something John suggested, which is that we're at a moment where we might be choosing between antitrust regimes and public utility or public regulation regimes, and it is a kind of framework which you'll hear a lot. You haven't heard as much at this conference as I would thought, which I find cheering, but it is overwhelmingly a false binary. Those of us who support reinstating Glass-Steagall, for instance, do so not at the cost of choosing not to regulate commercial banks, but rather choose to both split up the financial industry by function and separately regulate each subsidiary function. So the discussion I have today is about subsidiary function, imagining a antitrust regime, a successful antitrust regime as well. As the prior panel rightly indicated, there's a lot that we don't know and should know about how the platforms operate, but there are certain things that we do know about the way in which the targeted ad business model affects us and affects our communications environment. One is it's surveillance-based. It relies on spying and learning as much about us as humanly possible. That feature of targeted ads is quite dangerous for a vibrant communications infrastructure. If, for instance, our early postal regime had been spying-based, it would have radically transformed the early years of our country if the way the post office paid for itself was postmasters opening the mail and then sending politically targeted messages to people. Imagine how that would have affected who we are. If our sidewalks were now based on, funded by a surveillance model, then we would imagine sidewalks to encourage us to spend as much time as possible on the sidewalk, because they'd want to gather as much information as possible. And we would imagine people being more silent on the sidewalks instead of using them as a place to debate, argue, discuss. Second, we know, and I started to get into this, that the business model encourages spending as much time as possible inside this essential communications infrastructure. So that tends towards addiction. And it is dangerous to have essential communications infrastructure that is in fact unhealthy, to use Lena Kahn's term from last night. That in as much as we understand addiction and addiction-related pathologies to be against our human health, we shouldn't want essential communications infrastructure to be undermining our health. Third, we know that the targeted ad business model treats us all differently and isolates us, so that the information we get is separate. And that is also dangerous for a vibrant public sphere. Fourth, we know that it because of the desire to have people spend as much time on the platform as possible to sell ads, it prefers inflammatory, salacious information. So we have a business model that isn't just neutral in terms of civility, but actively encouraging aggression, anger, and extremism. So just to play this out, I imagine, and I lay this out in the paper, imagine your local public library being built on a targeted ads business model. If that's where the funding source is, what would you imagine the library would do? Well, first of all, it would have sensors everywhere, so it could listen to everything that was said. It would put the books out front that were the most controversial, as opposed to the best books. It would encourage you spending as much time as possible at the public library instead of going home and spending time with your family. And each person would be treated differently in the public library. So in fact, we'd have these features of the funding model undermining the thing that the public library itself is supposed to do. So, using the public utility regulation model, we should say, this isn't healthy, positive, and helping a kind of public sphere that we want. So for those having post-antitrust, for those aspects of the public sphere that are essential communications infrastructure, we should have a no targeted ads model. And until we have fully broken up these behemoths, we should say the entire platform shouldn't have a targeted ad model. Now, finally, I just want to say that this is the way in which these tech giants, and in this area I'm particularly focused on Facebook and Google, have taken over the essential communications infrastructure. And that was, again, a term that came out of my conversation with Lena, and I really like that framework of thinking about this as essential communications infrastructure. They've done it in two ways. One is by building communications infrastructure that we use, and the other is by actually taking over some of the traditional public sphere. So you all passed kiosks this morning on the way to work. These kiosks provide, quote unquote, free public Wi-Fi to people in New York, but that the way in which that free public Wi-Fi, that essential communications infrastructure is paid for, is through Google Sidewalks-backed consortium gathering information on all the people who pass by. So we have a double assault on the communications infrastructure, and there's something we can do about it.
Thank you. I know Sabile isn't on the panel, but I wonder if I can ask you a question about the public utility framework you talk about and whether it's a good fit for companies like Facebook. In a recent speech, Jack Balkin suggested it might not be. He noted that the standard reasons for making a company a public utility are to control price, secure universal access, and assure the quality of continuous service. But with Facebook, the price is free, access is already universal, and continuous service is almost always provided, in part to maximize time spent. So if the goal is to impose a ban on targeted ads, why adopt the public utilities framework at all? Why not just advocate for a ban directly on the basis of the public bads you talked about that are associated with ads?
Well, two different things. And one, I actually am more focused on the solution, but I'll tell you why I think that public utilities framework is helpful. One is that what we're really talking about, and Jack and I were talking about this last night, we still have a lot of work to do thinking it through, but that the price is not free. The price of entry is data. And in the public utility pricing framework, people are not allowed to opt out. Basically, your electricity utility or water utility can't say, well, in general, here's our pricing regime, but for you, you're going to get a different price. The regime is totally set. And so you can also treat this data as an inappropriate pricing regime, one that we are not going to allow. And so I think that's one way to think about that. And the other is that the other aspect of public utility regulation, a key principle, is non-discrimination. And the differential treatment and the sort of mode of differential treatment that targeted ads encourages fits within that non-discrimination framework.
So in the absence of targeted ads, you talk about how the platforms should move to a fee-based or a subscription-based model. And I wonder what that alternative model would look like and whether the adoption of a subscription-based model would, in sort of what you imagine, undermine a key principle that you care about, which is fair and equal access to essential infrastructure.
Okay, so the subscription-based model just really isn't that hard. Like we have done subscription-based models, for instance, for your telephone company. We do fee-based models for the post office. Today I was trying to figure out if you just did the United States, how much it would cost Facebook to get it to its current revenue, US-based per person revenue a year. I think it's about $9 a month. So if every user spent $9 a month in fees, they would have, Facebook would essentially get the same revenue model it does now. So think of all those costs I was just talking about. And the alternative model just isn't that costly. Now, what John really wants me to say, because I think he's even more excited about turning this totally public as opposed to public utility, is that the other option, the public utility model, is actually the mild model. The other option is what we have traditionally done with roads, schools, and other forms of privately created essential infrastructure, which is to say that those parts of that privately created infrastructure that have become so essential to public life are in fact public and then are paid for through taxes, that system. I do think a pricing regime is nonetheless required, that you shouldn't have differential pricing. So if it's $9 or $10, figuring out once it's a public utility, it's not a free-for-all on pricing.
I might open this up to everyone, and whether you have, you can respond to what Zephyr said and talk about whether you think eliminating targeted ads and moving to a subscription-based model for Facebook or Google will address the problems of the digital public sphere. I mean, are economic incentives the whole ballgame here, or are there some speech-related pathologies that we might expect to persist regardless of what business model the platforms have?
Could I just ask
sure.
a question? I mean, so there's entities on the internet that are, I turned it off. There are entities on the internet that are subscription-based, and there are big ones, other ones that are along the Google and YouTube and Facebook and so on, that are ad-based. So there's been the market has decided, has made a differentiation. And Zuckerberg said in his Senate, I think the first of the congressional testimony, that there was general understanding in the Valley that this kind of company could not be run on this basis. That even though the estimated fee for Facebook services was in between $25 to $26 to $85 a year, that people wouldn't pay it. So actually, from what we know about the people who were actually making the decisions and investing the money, unless you believe he's lying, which I don't, because we do notice a widespread choice of this model. The choice that's actually been made by forcing it to go to fees is for it either to not exist or to be much, much smaller. How do you respond? How does anyone respond to that? I don't want to put you on the spot.
I think people. I believe that people want to use email, have a social media place where they get to find out what is going on with their aunt. And I mean, again, we have a separate problem of so many different aggregated functions. But the argument used could be said of any kind of pricing regulation, that prior to that pricing regulation, a different business model existed, and that pathologies led us to shifting that business model to one that served the public good. So it would be the public choosing that this business model isn't serving our collective interests.
Just a quick point. I mean, the other point about this, too, is you're going to ban the model on the basis of the argument about the public bads, which I think are a little thinly argued, but you can revise that. You're actually going to have another issue here, which is it's going to be impossible to compete against the subsequent firms on the basis of an ad-based model, right? So you're going to have more concentration, because you can't compete on that basis anymore. That'll be banned. And when you ban pricing or a mode of competition, you're going to have more concentration at the margin.
Ganesh, let's go to you and your paper. You argue that the national security case against breaking up big tech isn't just wrong, it's backwards. And you argue that basically an ecosystem of smaller companies is actually necessary to protect America's national security, yes, but also its commitment to free speech. Can you walk us through that?
Thanks so much. Thanks for everyone for being here and listening through this. What I thought I'd do is just tell you a little bit about the paper in broad terms. You can read it in more detail. But the basic argument is we've been talking about different ways to break up and regulate big tech all day. And one of the arguments that you hear against breaking up big tech or regulating big tech companies is that we have to have big tech in order to support our national security in an area of great power competition, particularly with respect to China. You hear sort of casual versions of this in which people sometimes say we're in some sort of a Cold War over AI with the Chinese and are competing with them. Lots of other people, if you dig into the literature, will say that there's a bunch of things in that sentence that make no sense at all. But you'll hear that kind of argument. You'll hear that we have to have big tech in order to compete. We have to have big tech in order to win and in order for America to stay competitive on the global stage. I think that this argument isn't right. I think it's problematic. That's the argument that I make in the paper. And I'll walk you through a little bit of why. The first reason is that the argument, to the extent people make it, that big tech in quotes is competing with China in quotes, doesn't make much sense because, in fact, many of the big tech companies are operating in China, integrated with China, trying to spend more attention and time and effort and investment in China, rather than, in some sense, competing on national lines with China or Chinese companies per se. So that's particularly an issue, and it's an issue because that integration is not just an operation in a foreign country in the same way that Coca-Cola sells its product in multiple different countries. What people will say from Senator Mark Warner to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to former Secretary of Defense Ash Carter is that operations in China that are economic in nature with respect to Chinese companies are also integrated formally or informally with the government and in some cases even with the military. And people have written about a doctrine called civil-military fusion, by which innovations that come up in the civil context must be transferred over to the military as well. So there's at least some set of credible people who think that given the interconnections between economics and government in China, economic engagement and integration in China is partly integrated into the government, or at least influenced by it, or may transfer information over to it. So this kind of entanglement is potentially then problematic for U.S. national security in an era of great power competition for a number of reasons. In the reverse sense, it might create problems that we could be worried about, like espionage and surveillance. So, for example, you may have heard that the app Grindr had national security issues that emerged when there was Chinese investment that was going to come into and buy the app. And the reason is there's a lot of information in Grindr that people worried in the U.S. government might be used to blackmail or otherwise be a problem for people in the government. So there's worries about surveillance and espionage. There's worries about economic leverage. If economic power is political power and can be used as such, does this kind of entanglement create leverage for a foreign government over U.S. entities or citizens or the U.S. government? A third concern is censorship. We all probably saw the news a few weeks ago from the NBA and the Houston Rockets. There was no U.S. government censorship of the folks there, but the importance of access to a market means that there's pressure that is informally and indirectly pushed through, and everyone saw that moment. A fourth concern that we might be worried about is the spread of digital authoritarianism. If we think that the creation of better and better AI in particular and cooperation over that then is transferred into government and military hands and spread globally, then the model of digital authoritarianism potentially also spreads and becomes potentially more powerful. So each of these potentially seems like a significant concern. And the question is, what does breakups and antitrust or regulation have much to do with this, as opposed to some discussion about trade and international integration or globalization, that kind of thing? And my argument is that we need to think differently about two kinds of ecosystems. So one ecosystem is an ecosystem in which we have a very small number of extremely large market players. In that kind of system, those players are operating in a place like China, we'll use as an example, and are seeking market access there. That means that all of the risks that I just mentioned are pretty significant risks. There's only a small number of players who are subject to those concerns. Particularly if we think about the risk on censorship, if you have a small number of, say, content creators of different types, you can imagine that small number, for example, never wanting to put forward anything that would be critical of a foreign government for whom it seeks access into their markets. And they would do that not just in the foreign markets, but they would do it in US markets as well. In contrast, if you have an ecosystem with many, many small players, I think what you will end up with is a different kind of system. Some players in the kind of multivarious ecosystem will want to operate globally, will want to operate in those markets, will informally or formally work with foreign governments in order to follow the restrictions that are necessary to operate in those markets. Some will not. Some will want to focus their attention in other places. They will seek supply chains out of other places. They will seek to meet niche constituencies that look for other kinds of products and goods. And so a competitive marketplace offers a variety of other things that can be helpful in that regard. Okay, so that's the first argument about the kind of integration piece. A second argument on breakups. There's an argument that we need big tech to compete in this great power competition because big tech are the national champions who are providing us with the innovation that is going to bring AI and other great innovations to the fore. And I think this is an interesting argument because it's very striking how different it is from the standard argument that most people think about when you think about why we care about markets and capitalism. And the argument is that competition creates innovation. Competition creates innovation because competitors are working to one-up each other constantly and have a drive to actually compete and come up with something better, come up with something more exciting, come up with something that has more interest in the marketplace. In fact, one of the things that we've seen, and there are examples of this that I'm sure Richard knows far better than I do, but even in the context of some of our regulated monopolies, the innovation that the companies may focus on, if you're a monopolist, are innovations that are not going to challenge your business model or your dominance. And even AT&T, which spent a lot of time holding the power to create speakerphones, did not want to have speaker be a thing that was out there because of the concern that maybe it would be some sort of cannibalization of its own markets. So we might want innovation, and the way we do that is through competition and significant R&D funding that is publicly spent. This is how we have many of the innovations that we all enjoy and have thought about, is we had massive government spending in research and development over the years. The third point is a concern about our defense industrial base. So one of the challenges that we see when we think about our national security, if you look at the defense industry right now, is that a highly concentrated defense industry is problematic for our national security. There are a number of reasons for this. One is the innovation point that I made before for the same reasons. Second is the problem of the quality and speed of procurement. If you have a very small number of places from which you can procure very specific kinds of products or services, if you need to ramp up very quickly for some sort of emergency or other purposes, there's not actually domestic capacity for that. That can often move elsewhere, which in a crisis is a problem. We see this already. The Defense Department puts out reports that are cited in the paper that you can read where they talk about the serious problems we have in sectors like submarines and other areas to have the kind of sourcing that we need. And they identify consolidation as part of the problem. I think this is an issue as technology becomes more and more essential to thinking about core defense and national security, that if we have the same kind of very small consolidated sector, what you will see is the same problems that we currently have in the defense sector, that's the non-technological defense sector. And then the third category within the defense problem is what you see also when we have these consolidation, the consolidation in the defense sector is increasing defense budgets that are due not necessarily to needs, but to the fact that you have contracts that are extremely expensive because they're effectively with monopolists. There's no competition. Prices are going to be higher because there's a single buyer. It's the government. The government has to buy the particular needs that we have on the defense basis. There's only one person to buy it from, so they can charge higher prices for it. That's a problem not just because it's a higher price that all of us as taxpayers are spending, but that's money that could go to other things. Not, if we just want to stay within this universe, that could go, for example, to research and development to do exactly the kinds of competitive innovation that we might want, let alone the kind of guns versus butter trade-off that we could spend this on other kinds of social goods. So the argument of the paper is that for these reasons, the way we think about the competitive part with China and the threats that might raise, innovation domestically more broadly, and the defense industrial base and its strength, I think the argument that breaking up tech companies is a problem for national security is itself problematic, and there's a good case to be made that the opposite is true, that it's essential that we have a more competitive tech sector if what we want is to be competitive as a country.
Thank you. Richard, I think you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole host of issues that you've raised that often are neglected in discussions of present-day tech platforms. Are they American corporations, and does that matter? Bell in the 1920s divested of all its European manufacturing capacity because they were worried about antitrust, political implications. These are not issues today. Free expression dimension of this. Until comparatively recently, if you wish to tip American elections from overseas, and many groups have, Andrew Jackson was convinced that you needed to not charter the second bank because the British investors were surreptitiously funding American newspapers. And that continued in First World War, Second World War. British and German had a big investment in U.S. media. But you had to be spatially present. And this idea of how spatial boundaries have shifted, your paper really, I think more than any other papers, really brings this to light. That free expression historically has been predicated upon assumptions about spatial boundaries and temporal limits. A kind of implicit right to forget. If there's some story about you in a newspaper, well, a lot was said about Thomas Jefferson in Richmond in 1900, but you couldn't just click a button and find that. It was kind of lost. Or college students protesting, and they leave college, and then that memory isn't there. There's almost an implicit right to forget, but we don't have that anymore. And the information, as we know, elections can be coming from anywhere, and I, for one, am very troubled by foreign, let's say, involvement in U.S. elections. And that's an issue because of the nature of the networks. And this is something that is very different from early 20th century corporations, that the Bell managers in the 1950s were very clear that they were working in the national interest. The corporation was serving, when what is good for General Motors is good for the USA, that meant something. It wasn't just it was funny, but it meant something. And I'm not at all clear that this is true of the corporations today. And I think this is a reason for much more skepticism toward corporations. It is our government. It is not clear to me, it is our corporations. And therefore, this blanket skepticism about governments, I think this gets to your comment, really raises questions about who we think these corporations' interests are. Because it's not entirely clear that they're aligned with the United States, and it is not entirely clear to me that you cannot have a free expression regime that does not have spatial boundaries and temporal limits.
Thanks, Richard. I have a question about another free expression dimension of your piece, Ganesh. And this relates to your argument about the spread of digital authoritarianism. Even if breaking up the company succeeds in reducing their dependence on China, if their business models continue to rely on surveillance and improving surveillance technologies, can't we expect them to be part of the spread of digital authoritarianism at home?
So 2 things. First, I think that one of the things that we should all be mindful of as a general matter is that there's no one solution for everything, and no set of solutions well, that's not true. No set of solutions necessarily means you can't support other kinds of solutions for other kinds of problems. So there's lots of different problems. We can imagine lots of different solutions for lots of different problems, and some combination of them is going to be the right kind of place where we probably want to be. So I would start by saying the set of problems that I've identified and the set of solutions to them are not a claim that this solves every possible problem that one could come up with for tech companies, companies generally, national security questions, great power competition, or whatever else. It's one set of things, and we should be open to others. In terms of what that does domestically, I would actually put it slightly differently, which is that I think the model in the United States might end up less as digital authoritarianism per se, which I kind of take as the government as the lead, but a more digital oligarchy where the private sector is the lead. And that's a difference between the two. In both cases, there's a fusion of public and private. It's just who's wagging, which is the tail and which is the dog that is being wagged, and how you think about that. So that's a place where I think maybe we could be concerned about it. And just to go back to Richard's point, it partly relates to this other question, which is, how do we think about the interests when we talk about political power as well? So if entities have an interest in lobbying government in order to maximize their profits, then there's a question of where are they getting their profits and what is the most profit maximizing thing to do. If the things that are profit maximizing to do as a matter of business model actually operate directly against US interests in a democratic sense or a national interest sense or free expression sense or otherwise, we would expect companies to, and some might argue even be required to as a matter of their duties to their shareholders, to advocate for those kinds of policies because they need to support their bottom line. Now, there'd be a debate about that in a variety of ways, but there's an argument one might make to that effect. That is also problematic, I think, in this regard, and what it means then is what you would expect is to see increasing lobbying that points in a direction that could be deeply problematic to kind of core freedom of expression and speech and democratic values.
So I have a question. American corporations oversaw, particularly Walmart, the greatest reduction of poverty in human history. And that reduction redounded primarily, as we know now, to poor people in China and India. Not to, we're now told that there was a China shock and America paid a price for it. Some people don't believe that, but there was a China shock. Those were, see, these arguments go about any kind of globalization of a corporation. They're not for this is Trumpian stuff almost, it's borderline. Are they national or not? Now I want to come, before I got Richard going here, but rightly so actually. I want to push on another issue about the national, first of all, this is discussed very much all the time, in the terms of, are the tech companies patriotic enough in the conservative sphere here, public sphere? Because they suspect, being out in California and all, that they're not patriotic enough, right? So you get these arguments. There's a weird thing about of Facebook's nationalism or Americanness that's going to come out, I think, in the next couple of years, which is, if you look closely at Facebook in the last couple of months, there's been a decision that's made to give freedom of expression priority. In both, they changed their values statement as a corporation, they changed the charter. The charter announced of the board that we've talked about had that in it too, and Zuckerberg's cover letter and the Zuckerberg Georgetown speech.
I'll be quick.
They understand that to be identifying Facebook as an American company. So the Americanness of it, which goes, if Kate Klonick's piece tells you that about 2008, 2009, or 2011, the content moderators started saying, oh, this is like American stuff, where the freedom of speech stuff, but we're everywhere, right? But I think they're going to actually emphasize their American quality in the content moderation, and that's going to create problems for them, actually, or possibly.
I also just want to respond to something you said, because I think there's a big difference in how we think about this then, which is, I think, for me, the core question is one about how we think about democracy. And part of that is that the concern, and this is, I mean, you know, I don't think it's Trumpian to say that what we should be concerned about is significant lobbying of the U.S. government in a way that is deeply unrepresentative. And that's a problem in our campaign finance sector. It's a problem of lobbying. It's a problem of corruption in Washington in a serious way that I think is very different. And so I would say that the kind of influence that we talk about there, both whether that's internal to a company in terms of the power, for example, that workers and unions might have within it and the decision-making that gets made, you know, whether there are people on boards, for example, as has been proposed in many places. There are a variety of changes there that I think are different, that are not the same as that. So I think there's a democratic component here that's very important for how we think about what kind of society we want to live in.
All right, that was
I think
impulsive.
Zephyr's been waiting, so I'm going to let her respond.
I want to say something. That covered much of what I want to say, but I want to briefly say the thing I wish I'd said earlier when I just smirked when John said something about I don't think Zuckerberg lied, because I realize it's worth more than a smirk. I think there's very good reason to think that Zuckerberg may have lied in congressional testimony recently about what he knew around about Cambridge Analytica. I think those questions need to be asked. The absolute absence of insight we have into how Facebook operates is a current democratic disaster.
Right.
And although I accuse Zuckerberg as an individual, I want to echo Brandeis saying, or was it Hand, saying neither our character or our intelligence can stand the concentrations of power. You, maybe Richard can tell me who said that. But this is not an accident. The behavior of Zuckerberg as a person is not an accident of his own personality. It's an accident of somebody having a grotesque amount of power in our democracy that is more of an emergency than I may have communicated in my remarks.
Yeah, and just really quickly, I mean, the Chinese government deserves a certain amount of credit for bringing a quarter of the world's people out of poverty. Walmart was part of that, but Walmart's not the whole story. This is a territorially bounded regime that is, as Ganesh has pointed out, is very authoritarian, whose values are very different from ours, who have no commitment to free expression. And I do think that we're setting up a conflict with China. If we care about free expression, we need to take this much more seriously and hold the corporations to the fire. And some of the presentations here have just suggested all we're talking about is consumer interest or individuals. We're talking about extraordinarily powerful, concentrated enterprises dominated by a small number of people, perhaps a couple thousand. This is extremely unusual in American history. The founders would have found it deplorable, and I believe unless we keep their feet to the fire, we're not going to have these salutary results, because these corporations do not have the incentive to do the right thing unless they are obliged to. And I see no evidence in the historical record that they would have. And one of the salutary features about the antitrust or anti-monopoly tradition is it has forced corporations to behave in ways they otherwise would not have, to support social responsibility, to support public interest in a way that's redounded to the public good. But in the neoliberal regime, this has been discouraged, and the consequences have been, I think, frightening for democracy, for free expression, and for the future of the kind of humane society that our founders tried to create. We are acting in ways that the founders would have found outrageous, and it seems to me we need to call that out if we care about our 18th century Enlightenment tradition.
I think we have about 15 minutes now for Q&A, so I'm sure we'll have other questions from the audience which will inspire just as lively a debate. Right at the back there.
From what we know of the history of the vagaries of the politics of broadcasting. I go back to what would have happened if Nixon hadn't had Watergate. He would have ended public television and destroyed the CPB. All the funding fights that went on for the next few decades. What happened in 1994 when they decided to make a political football, PBS, etc. So how do you bulletproof reform? Secondly, there are people who are just taking their own initiative. They're not waiting for legislation. They're doing of variegated needs. But what about them? They are taking the steps themselves. They're ignoring, they're doing it illegally, of course, but they are legitimately dealing with what they perceive to be the interests of their local communities in light of all these different problems that we talk about where people have not paid attention to. So how do we deal with that phenomenon?
I can talk about BBC. The BBC that we know today was not the BBC in its first 20 years. They cut a deal with the newspapers in Britain that they would not do any news reporting that would interfere with the newspaper model. And that's a very interesting difference from the United States, where you don't have a government champion, and therefore you don't have that kind of conflict. After the Second World War, the BBC developed as an independent corporation. Emily Bell is not here. But my British and European friends are sanguine about the possibility of an independent media. It may be that U.S. political economy won't permit it, but PBS in many households, or the national public media, is the most reliable radio and television news source. So we do have something of a track record. But we made a very small investment compared to what's been made in Britain and Denmark or European countries in any kind of public media. So you could make the argument the experiment's not been tried.
Very briefly, you cannot bulletproof reform. Along with these incredibly serious interventions that we need to pursue, we also need the intervention of recognizing there is no end of history, and actively engaged citizens are necessary. So it is a perpetual job of democracy for us to be recognizing that it's going to be difficult. It's going to be hard work. The one thing that I did want to mention as your broadcaster, the other great advantage of getting rid of the targeted ad model is, and I can't believe I didn't mention this earlier, is one of the horrors of our current state is our communications infrastructure is fighting against the producers of news and information, and has a direct conflict of interest with them. Recently, Facebook announced that the previously informal feudal state would become a formal feudal state, and those producers would get paid for sharing their their information on Facebook. This is incredibly dangerous. It's not just that it's concentrated, it's an incredibly dangerous feudal model. When you remove the targeted ad model and move to a fee model, you remove some of the direct competition between the communications infrastructure and the news sources that use it.
So I guess I would go back to the issue about foreign countries and lobbying. Essentially, you're talking about a problem that has existed once the United States became a global power in the Second World War, after the Second World War. It's not unique to the tech companies. Generally speaking, that has been on the speech side and participation side, that's been resolved, or at least been treated with or dealt with by disclosure. So everyone talks to foreign agents every day in Washington, D.C., and they have to be, and indeed, and after a couple of years back, RT, a Russian television channel, has been in the United States for as long as cable, maybe, and it's now a registered agent. So in a sense, I think that's the crucial question there. There was something else I wanted to say just to the, anyway, I'll come back to it. Getting old.
Other questions? Yes, you.
Where's the common ground between the Teachout and the
You're both sympathetic to free expression.
You want to do this, or you want me to do it?
Repeat the question.
You asked where we found common ground for a second? I think we found common ground in some suspicion of government making content-based choices, or deep suspicion of government making content-based choices.
You believe in free speech. It's just we probably have differences about what that means in concrete cases.
Very significant differences, but yes.
I think apparent for all to see. Okay, over there.
Hi, my name is Albert Khan. I'm the Executive Director of the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project. I was wondering to what extent you thought that the migration away from targeted advertisement to a fee-based model could be accompanied by non-targeted advertising, undifferentiated ads that sort of replicate the newspaper ad model more directly.
You were nodding. Do you want to?
No, I just thought it was a good question for you.
No, it's a great question. I want to hear. Of course, I want to hear what you think about the targeted ad model. You actually can see some ambivalence in the paper. We settle on banning targeted ads, but I think there's a question about for communications infrastructure whether you just ban ads altogether. And in fact, in my presentation, I suggest a fee model because I think the fee, or if you turn it into something totally fee, or if it is truly public fund model, is actually better and cleaner, and that the line, then getting away from the line between targeted ads and untargeted ads, and it also gets away from the competition. You move farther away. So I think I prefer moving to a total fee model. The worst pathologies, however, come out of targeted ads. So I think we settled on the lower hanging fruit because so many just context-based ads do not bring up the surveillance problems, they do not bring up the differentiation problems, the isolation problems, and they do not encourage extremism in the same way. So there's reasons to move all the way, but I think for the worst pathologies, the targeted ads does most of the work.
The next panel perhaps is the issue. I mean, a total ban on ads. Commercial speech doesn't have zero.
For essential communications infrastructure. So if I have a ban on ads in a library, if I go to the town of Montclair, and I say we don't want ads in Montclair, I don't think that would be a problematic local municipal.
Well, yeah, I have two questions about that. One is, much of the problem with journalism in the last decade is that the money that was going from advertising to journalism now goes from advertising to Facebook and Google. And that's one issue. But the second issue is that if you look at this historically over the long term, I edited a book on this with a barrister a couple of years ago. We cannot find instances in which news pays for itself, that advertising has paid for news since the 18th century. And I worry if you are banning advertising, I don't believe a fee-based system is going to generate the news that we need.
Oh, I would never ban advertising for newspapers. In fact, the opposite. So you don't have poor people's news. You don't have local news without advertising. You don't have working. So I actually it reinserts a funding stream. If you remove it from Facebook and Google, it reinserts it in the Poughkeepsie Journal.
So I remember what I wanted to say before, and I don't know how I forgot this because, ladies and gentlemen. I think it's on. Please realize, if you try to create something like NPR or PBS for anything, you may get lucky, and every conservative in the country will die of an aneurysm immediately from being so outraged. Then you'll be able to do it. But if they don't, they will pay any price, bear any burden to stop that. Imagine, and maybe this is your situation, I'm open to that. Imagine you're listening to a news program and you are aware that you have been compelled at some measure at some point to contribute to that, and it is something you disagree with deeply. It's one thing to have things that are disagree with deeply that emerge. It's another thing to be compelled to contribute to it. You may be right that you can do this, but it's in a different world than we live in now, a deeply different world politically.
You had a question over here.
Imagine every non-conservative person really trying to do it and doing it. Why can't we imagine both rather than just imagine the fear?
Just imagine what?
You said let's be afraid of every conservative putting obstacles to the creation of an NPR or PBS.
Right.
And I'm challenging you, imagine the reverse.
that conservatives would support it, or
No, that the Democrats will fight for it, actually,
well, right, but I'm assuming,
rather than being afraid,
yeah, but
which is the reality we have now.
So one of the, I mean, I understand that this is a conference to hash through ideas at an early stage, but what I see here is like the issue is this is half of the country at most, right, is represented here. There's another half out there that has very different views about this. And so I'm assuming that to do something, I mean, the early history of NPR is complicated anyway, but or PBS, I'm assuming that you can't just do it with 50% plus one now.
We are here because it was all started with 15% under Reagan. So I believe that if we start building a counter-revolution, we can reach that.
No, that's possible. I'm just telling you, I think what was fundamentally discounted, and I heard about discussions of public broadcasting here, was that there are many people in this society that find that to be a horrific idea. And
It's
would-
possible.
Oh,
It's
it's not
possible.
possible. I know them all.
All right. Zephyr, did you want to add something? Well, we have time for probably
Well,
one
yes,
more
if it's impossible, why do we have NPR and PBS? How about that?
Well, NPR, part of it is that it's now not public, or at least they argue that, right? PBS is, I haven't followed it closely, but it was shrinking, and it was more dependent on public. Essentially, both of them followed the LBJ model, which was, he said he learned from Roosevelt, you just get the program started and it expands. And that turned out to be, NPR went to a private funding mostly. Turned out to be kind of wrong.
Can you hear me?
I think so. Yeah.
So through this whole discussion, we've talked about government, we've talked about technology companies, but we haven't talked about the ad industry itself. And who's focusing on the ad industry? The ad industry started all of this. Do you really think these tens of thousands of jobs, these billions of dollars, are just going to sit around while somebody makes decisions about what the technology companies can and can't do?
So I'm sorry if I wasn't clear. I think this is very much about the ad industry, that Google and Facebook are ad companies. They're ad companies. I mean, so much of the problem here is that there's so many different things at once. You mean the ad industry outside of Google and Facebook?
I'm talking about all the ads you're talking about that are on Google and Facebook.
Oh,
and
I see.
Targeted advertising, which was created by the advertising industry. Are you just who's focusing on the ad industry? Is anybody talking to the ad industry? Is anybody thinking about regulations about the ad industry? Something like $10 billion is going to be spent on the next election.
So also, well,
From
also the ad industry is much more efficient than it used to be.
Right.
Because of Facebook.
That's
from an
right.
economic standpoint.
It was their fantasy. For
So I
decades.
take your question to be, will there be significant you could ask different questions. One is, will there be significant stiff resistance from parties other than the tech giants on a banning targeted ad model? And the answer is yes. This is not, I think we have a lot of work to do. I think it's worth it for some of the reasons I started to lay out, and we'll continue to have that conversation. Unlike some, I think it is very valuable that there are ad-based newspapers. And so just repeating what I was starting to say earlier, I think one of the great values here is that it redirects the flow of those ads towards news publications away from these platforms, which has, I think, many different effects. But yes, in terms of political resistance, I think it'll be quite significant.
So,
The other thing I would say about just specifically political ads, Dorsey made the natural decision, which was not to have them. There's no way on earth that the revenue from political ads on Facebook is worth the trouble and the CEO's time and all of that stuff. So the normal thing would be to get rid of them. So there are problems associated with it, but there may be a lot of trouble over the next year or two.
So unfortunately, I think that's all we have time for, but thank you to the